From the 2016 National Volunteering Conference, Canberra, you're listening to a series of podcasts powered by Pop-Up Radio Australia.
This morning you've come in to hear David Locke talk about exploring volunteering in the Australian charitable sector. David is the Assistant Commissioner for the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission, ACNC, to all of us who are in the know. ACNC is the independent national regulator of charities, still, which is great. In 2014, the ACNC published the first evidence-based research report into the charity sector, analysing data reported by 38 registered charities. And David, I'd like you to welcome him. David Locke, as the Assistant Commissioner, prior to that was the Chief Advisor to the ACNC Task Force before becoming the Assistant Commissioner of the Charity Services at ACNC. And David was formerly the Executive Director of Charity Services at the Charity Commission of England and Wales, so you might notice a slight non-Australian accent. But he's been here for about 4 years now, so he may have caught some Australianisms. So I'd like you to welcome David. David's going to speak for about 30 minutes. You will get an opportunity to ask questions before we ring the bell and move on to the next one. So please welcome David.
Well, thank you very much, Tracy, and thank you, everybody, for coming to the session today. I've been coming to the Volunteering Australia conferences for a couple of years now, and this is the first time I've been able to say that the ACNC is here to stay, and it's the first time since we were a twinkle in the Gillard government's eye that there's actually been cross-party support for the ACNC in the continuation of the national regulation of charities. Which is quite refreshing. I was at a conference about 6 months ago when I was walking on stage. They were actually playing Staying Alive from the Bee Gees, so we've had quite a long period of uncertainty. We were established with 3 objects, and the first one really is about promoting trust and confidence in charities, and a lot of that is about the register of charities, but also the way in which we regulate, the way in which we try and weed out where there is misconduct or mismanagement in the administration of charities, and give the public really confidence that if they're giving to a registered charity, then they're giving to a genuine organisation that's doing good in the community. The second object we have is about education and advice and support. It's really about how we can play a part in ensuring that the sector is sustainable, is independent and is vibrant. A lot of that is really through providing a secure regulatory framework for charities, but it's also about assisting people who are running charities. Now, we know that with a small number of large organisations, there will be some board members who are actually paid for their services, but the vast majority of people who are running charities in Australia are unpaid volunteers. And they give, many of you in the room, and I've done it myself throughout my career, give a huge amount of time in terms of ensuring proper governance, proper direction, and bringing to the table the sorts of things that Robin was talking about in her session this morning. Bringing some of the passion, the drive, some of the vision, some of the optimism that's essential for successful organisations to grow. And the third object we've got is about reducing red tape, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But principally what I wanted to talk about was some of the data that the ACNC has been gathering. So when charities report to the ACNC, not only are they reporting to us as the regulator, but we're publishing that information for the public. We do that so that we can show that charities are transparent and accountable, and the public can get information about organisations. And there's now an awful lot of information on the charity register. We've got the governing rules, the details of the directors, what the charities have been doing in the last year. We've got a lot of information that is now published. But at the ACNC, we know that charities are fed up to the back teeth of producing information to government that then doesn't really do anything. So publishing it for the community is one part of it, but what we've always said is we'll only ask for information that we need. We'll publish it unless there's exceptional reasons to do so, but we'll also put this data back to the sector in a digestible, usable form. And so a lot of what we've been doing as we've been getting the annual information statements in is getting them analysed and actually giving the data back to the sector, and that's some of what I'm going to talk about today. So the information that we've got on charities now is close to census-type data on the registered organisations. And the data that I'm going to give you today is really based on about 38,000 of those charities. What we did with the annual information statements is have them analysed by the University of New South Wales and the Centre for Social Impact there, and we've produced a series of reports. So there's a main report which will contain some of the data I'm talking about. All of these are available on the ACNC website. If you go to acnc.gov.au, you'll see the link through to the Charities report, and you can have a look at the main report. We also published a report on the disability sector in December last year as well, and you'll get the link through to that. Now, why we did that was that we're aware that there's huge change going on in disability services. Any of you who are working in organisations that are providing disability services will be grappling with how NDIS is transforming the framework and what this really means for you. And so we think was important to take a snapshot to say, what does the sector look like at the moment? And then we'll be repeating that over the next couple of years to actually see what change has actually happened. So we know there's a lot of talk about mergers, a lot of organisations are talking about winding up. You know, there's a lot of concern about whether the for-profits will move into this space. We want to have accurate data that the sector can use and we can talk to government about to say, not just anecdotal stories, but the reality of what's happening is this. And that's part of the reason we've done that report. We've got a report that's coming out in a couple of weeks with regard to red tape, and that's analysing the information that charities have themselves provided about the burden of red tape. So in the annual information statement, we've asked questions about that, and that's an analysis of that information. And we've also got a report coming out on international charities as well. If you haven't had a chance to do so, I would encourage you to just take down this website or just have a look at it. It's the australiancharities.acnc.gov.au. Because not only have we got these static reports, but we've put the data on what's called a data cube, and it means that you can go into that and you can drill down. You can actually segment the sector and the data either by the state in which you're based and or the type of organisation you are. So you can look, for example, at what's happening with disability charities or education charities in Tasmania, in Victoria. You can look at the size of organisation, etc. So if you're interested in some of the data that I'm going to talk about, do have a look at this data cube. And as we get more data in, that's being uploaded to it as well. So it's just going to get richer and richer as we move forward. But what we can see from the information we had on the first about 38,000 of these information statements is that there's an incredibly diverse charity sector out there. On the website, you'll see a map of Australia, a bit like this, and there is actually a dot for every single registered charity on there. And you can zoom into an area and you can see in greater detail. If you hover your cursor over any of those dots, you'll get the details of the charity that's actually located at that address. And you can drill right down. So it's really interesting to actually have a look at that and see where organisations are, what the spread is. You'll also see what the income and expenditure of each of those charities is as well. But looking at the information across the piece, what we can see at the moment, there's just over 53,000 charities registered with the ACNC. And what we can see is that 64% of those are what are called small. So they have an annual income of less than $250,000 a year. So very big part of the sector, really nearly 2/3 of the sector, has an annual income under $250,000 a year. So many of those charities won't actually have accommodation, or they won't have any, certainly won't own any property. And many of them, as we'll come on to see, won't actually be employing any staff. They'll be entirely volunteer-run organisations. The classification of medium is an annual income of between $250,000 and $1 million a year. So still in comparative terms, quite small organisations really. It's quite a small turnover. And you'll see that 17% of the charities registered with us fall into that category. So only 19% of the charities registered with the ACNC actually are large, and large is any organisation with an annual income over $1 million a year. So that's interesting in terms of looking at really what the sector looks like. We're getting about 10 new charity applications every single day. So what that means is that 10 people somewhere in Australia wake up every morning and think, I'm going to set up a charity today. That's a lot of new applications, a lot of new organisations. But what we do also know is that many are winding up every day as well. So actually, since we've been going, we've now deregistered or revoked over 14,000 charities, and we've only registered 8,000. So the numbers are actually coming down rather than going up. But it does show that a lot of small, particularly small organisations get set up, perhaps don't go anywhere, perhaps the people who are running them move on, perhaps they don't raise the money that they initially thought they would, or they've actually run out of steam. And really one of the things we're interested in exploring is, well, what's actually going on there? You know, why are these organisations folding? Is that a problem, or is that just part of a natural cycle? Is the stuff that we could do to help support those organisations, what does this really mean? And I think over time we'll have a bit of a picture. But what we can see is that there's a lot of charities that have been around for a long time that clearly have good local support in the community they're based. And so 33 years is the average age of charities on the register, and there are a number of organisations, 6% of charities, that have actually been going for over 100 years now. When we look at the financial information that's been reported by charities, and because we know that this is only the first 38,000, it's an underestimate of what the total figure is finally going to be. But just on the basis of the verified information that charities have submitted, and this is just charities, not all not-for-profits, it's just the charities that we're talking about, they've actually got a combined income of over $103 billion a year. So a very significant economic contribution to Australia's economy. Charities spend during that period, they've reported spending $95 billion a year. So most charities are really operating a fairly balanced budget, as you'd expect. And I think when we looked at it, on the whole, most have a surplus or deficit of no more than 20% of their total income. What we found is that trusts, and particularly philanthropic trusts, are more likely to have, a higher surplus. They're likely to be more conservative in terms of spend. Community service organisations, community welfare organisations tend to have the lowest threshold there. They're really very often running things on, the smell of a damp rag, I think it's called. Is that right? Is that? I am trying with my phrases, but I don't do it very well. But when we look at where the money's spread amongst those charities, the 53,000 or the 38,000 I'm talking about here, what we can see is that the largest 5% of charities actually have 80% of the income of the sector. And 10% of charities actually control 90% of the sector's assets. So we're looking at a sector where there's actually about 1,400 charities that are mega big, including, of course, some of the universities and big hospital trusts, often things that people don't necessarily always think of as charities, as well as the Red Crosses of this world and the World Visions and the other very large charities. They account for 90% of the assets and 80% of the income. And what we can see, I talked about the percentage of charities, nearly 2/3, that have an annual income under $250,000. Well, it's actually even smaller than that. So when we've drilled down, we can see that 31.5% actually have an income of less than $50,000. So a lot of these will be parent and community associations. They might be parts of the RSL movement that are actually charitable. They may be country women's guilds. There'll be all sorts of organisations, but also many will be, in every sort of community and every regional town really across Australia. There'll be a number of these small organisations as well. So in terms of the assets and income, it looks a bit like that. Now, where does the sector's money come from? And again, this is the information that charities are reporting to us. Well, they've reported 6.8 billion comes from donations and bequests. So this is really from the public in terms of public collections or donations or fundraising. It's also any bequests or money that comes in through estates and wills. 42 billion is actually coming from government. Now, at the moment, we don't separate that. We haven't asked charities to say how much is state government and how much is federal government. We may look at that in the future. But 42 billion comes from government. Most of that will be actually funding the provision of services in communities that otherwise government would have to do or have to carry out. And of course, education, if you think of independent schools and things that are in here as well, there's a lot of education funding that comes through. The biggest chunk, though, is actually 54.5 billion. Now, at the moment, we haven't broken this down, but we are looking to do this in future annual information statements. This will be fees that charities get for services. It will be investment income that charities have. It will be trading income that charities earn through any trading, either through sale of goods or trading in terms of any services. But what we can see is that the larger the charity, the more likely they are to get government funding, and the smaller organisations, as we know, it's much harder for smaller organisations often to secure government funding, particularly federal government funding. So 64% of charities actually had no government grants at all. And you can see there's a bit more information there. Now, with regard to donations from the public, one of the key things that charities very often want and often need is deductible gift recipient status, or to be a DGR, so that people who are giving money can actually get a tax rebate in respect of they can offset their donation against their income tax return. And what we can see is that larger organisations are much more likely to be DGRs. So about 40% of charities on our register have got DGR status at the moment. 60% haven't. But if you look, for small charities, only 30% have got that, whereas for larger organisations, 66%. So we need to look at why that might be and drill down a little bit more to see, is it because small charities are finding the process too hard and can't apply, or is it because of the makeup of the sector? But I do think there's a challenge for us. If it's about organisations not understanding and finding it too difficult, how can we work to try and make that a simpler process? Now, we're at the volunteering conference, so I thought I'd talk about the data that we've gathered with regard to volunteers as part of this data set. So it's quite limited what we've got. And at the moment, looking at the 2014 information, which is really what I've got at the moment, we ask a question about the number of volunteers. We grouped it with the 2014. We're actually not going to group it moving forward. We're going to ask people for specific numbers. And we also asked a question about the amount of hours that the charity spent on reporting, particularly reporting to government or funders, and how much of that was volunteer time. Again, to try and get a sense, really, of what the red tape burden is that charities are subject to. What our data shows is just with these charities, just with this data set, there are over 2 million volunteers in charities. Now, we know if we look at all not-for-profits, that figure's much higher. But just for charities, they're reporting 2 million volunteers. But what we can also see is that over 44% of all charities have got no paid employees at all. So they're entirely volunteer run. And that's why conferences like this and some of the support that's provided by peak bodies and others, as well as hopefully some of the stuff we give, is so important. So we recognise that most of the people we're engaging with and providing services to are doing it in their own time. When we look at the type of organisations that fall within that 44%, it's quite interesting and not what I would expect. But here we've got the breakdown of volunteers according to the size classifications of charities I talked about earlier. So you've got large charities in the first column, medium charities and small charities. So small charities are much less likely to report that there's no volunteers. They're much more likely to have volunteers than large charities. The common largest group really for small organisations would be about 37%. 37% would report between 1 and 10 volunteers. But interesting sort of breakdown really in terms of that. As I said, when we look at the charities that fall into that 44% that have got no employees, that are entirely volunteers, we've got trusts there, philanthropic organisations, which is interesting. We've also got international charities, which I found quite surprising as being one of the groups that are most likely to fall into that. And one of the things that we think is going on there, we'll drill down a bit more in this international charity report that we've got coming out, but we think that a lot of faith-based organisations, a lot of churches are probably reporting doing some work overseas or sending funds overseas, and that might be distorting that figure. And they may have no volunteers, but that's quite interesting. Charities that are least likely to be entirely volunteer-run: law, advocacy, health organisations, education, research. Probably not terribly surprising there. But again, here, charities most likely to have volunteers: international charities, environmental charities. Culture and recreation, perhaps not surprising. A lot of people will volunteer in those sorts of organisations. Religion, we thought, would be very high up there. But again, this international, I think, was a bit of a surprise, and that's something that we're looking at. So how much time are volunteers actually spending on some of the red tape, some of the reporting that I talked about? Well, according to the answers that we've had, on average they're spending about 21 hours a year doing reports and reporting. And that doesn't include the reports to the ACNC or any reports that may go into the ATO. So a fairly significant amount of time is being spent by volunteers on this sort of reporting. And the highest areas were about emergency relief, recreation, social clubs, and international charities. So what other data have we got on volunteering? Well, of course, we've not only got the ACNC data, we've also got other data out there, and some of that's been mentioned this morning. If we look at the data that the Australian Bureau of Statistics produce, and effectively what they do is they do a sample and then they extrapolate that to come up with a total figure. We certainly saw that in the 2012-2013 satellite account, they were reporting 521 million hours were volunteered. Now that's not just charities, that's not-for-profits, and that might be other forms of volunteering as well. But that was given an imputed value of 17.3 billion. I think that's probably an underestimate in terms of the economic impact and economic value that volunteers contribute. One of the things that we've been talking about with the data that we have is actually the economic importance of the not-for-profit sector and charities, and actually saying to government that this is an investment in terms of the funding that you've been giving to organisations. And actually, if you're looking at not-for-profits delivering services versus for-profits delivering services, then there are some added value, added considerations that you need to consider. So if you give $100 of government funding to a not-for-profit, what are they going to do to that? Well, we think that there's going to be volunteering value, probably equivalent to $10 that will go into that. We think that charities will often contribute funds from other sources that they have as well. That's clearly because often they're not getting full cost recovery for the services, and it's a bit of a problem. But really what you can see, for every $100 that's provided by government, you'll get an output for the community of about $120. What happens if you actually give the funds to a for-profit organisation? Well, you're not going to get $100 going directly through to the community. The very nature of for-profit organisations is you've got to make a profit. There's got to be a dividend or distribution that comes out of that. So we're talking to the government in terms of, what this will mean is less than $100, and in the example I've given here, $90 actually going through to the end services. We've commissioned research as well to look at public attitudes to giving and public attitudes towards the sector. We've been given by Parliament an object to increase public trust and confidence in charities. So really what we wanted to do was try and understand, well, what are the factors that promote the public having confidence in the sector, and what are the things that can undermine that? And from the research that we've commissioned, what we can see is that the key factors that influence public support are the cause, and people being able to connect with the cause or the vision or mission of the organisation. Personal connections, be that a personal connection because you or your family have been particularly affected by an issue that this charity may be working with, or it can be a personal connection with people who are running or connected with that organisation. If you can show that there's a clear benefit, why do Fred Hollows do so well with fundraising from the public? It's because they have a simple proposition that people can connect with, and they can see there's a connection between the amount of money they give and actually what is going to be delivered. And the challenge for charities is really to be able to try and get that clear benefit and clear connection in the public mind. What the research showed is that familiarity with a charity is very important. So if they've heard of your charity, then the public are much more likely to give. Now that's not just household name charities, it will be the hospice down the road, it will be the local community organisation. If you're endorsed by a trusted source, then that is a factor. And the reputation is very important. And in terms of reputation, one of the big issues is if there are negatives. So if they've heard bad things about you, that has a disproportionate impact. The things that actually concern the public, and the public have said in our research is most likely to impact on whether they give or whether they volunteer. Fundraising methods can be an issue of concern, particularly if they think that the charity is hassling people, then that can be problematic. Uncertainty with regard to will the funds go to the end cause, and this takes us into very difficult territory of what percentage and ratios. It's a deeply flawed argument. I'm happy to talk about that under questions. Lack of familiarity, if they haven't heard of the organisation, are also factors. Now, there's much more significant research than this that's being undertaken at the moment by Queensland University of Technology, and they're undertaking it on behalf of the Government Prime Minister's Community Business Partnership. And it'll be fascinating to see in this big cross-Australia survey actually what comes out. But at the moment, the information that we've got is as set out here. Mentioned a little bit about red tape. A lot of the work that we're doing at the moment is trying to drive some of the red tape reduction, and we are finally getting some traction. This is a little diagram that really sets out some of the duplication and different arrangements that we've got, principally with regard to fundraising. But of course, as we know, there's duplication where you're an incorporated association currently reporting to the state government as well as the ACNC. Just on fundraising, we now have a committee of all the commissioners of consumer affairs who are working on harmonisation of the reporting. And we've actually got some governments that are moving on this now. So we have South Australia introduced the legislation on 10th of December, which will do away with the need for you to have a fundraising licence or report in South Australia. We've got Tasmania and ACT following suit, and we're working with the larger states as well. There's guidance that we've got on our website with regard to volunteering. I think for volunteers, some of the things that Robin talked about earlier are critical. It's really, do you identify with the cause and the values of the organisation? Is the organisation that you're involved in, respecting you and the contribution that you can make as well? And I spent, before joining the Charity Commission in the UK, 10 years running community legal centres where I had over 100 volunteers and managing those in a way that actually really ensures that the volunteers respected and valued, that their individual contribution is important, and that actually the organisation is getting out of it really what it needs as well, and that volunteers are valued, not just used. But thank you everybody, and have a great conference.